Uh, Welcome, good afternoon, welcome to the class of Professor S.K. Paul, Head of the Department of English, BRA, Bihar University, Muzaffarpur. Welcome the students of class note, students of PhD coursework. So, dear students, today I am going to discuss on the aspect of psychological novels. So therefore the title of my this lecture is psychological novels and novelists. So let I just begin. From the ancient belief in humors to the 20th and 21st centuries, psychoanalytic and pharmacological methodologies, diverse theories about the mind have affected the literary production of novelists. Categorization according to these theories is difficult because authors tend to mix them and use more than they admit. Hermann Hesse's works, for example, began to overflow with the analytical psychology of Carl Jung after the latter treated him. Yet Hesse tended to belittle that influence and spoke of being closer to Sigmund Freud. Consequently, psychological long fiction is most easily categorized not according to medical theories but according to our literary techniques, playful etiology, unrepentant confession, a stream of consciousness, and Kafkaesque fantasy. The first point to discuss: playful etiology. Charles Baudelaire's novella La Fanfarlo, published in 1847, The Flaunter, attributes the idiosyncrasies of the protagonist, Samuel Kramer, to his mixed parentage, German and Chilean, his French education, and his heaven-bestowed partial genius. Baudelaire is thus practicing etiology, diagnosing the causes of condition, but not with the seriousness or a physician would adopt. Instead, he explains a condition through a whimsical mixture of rationales based on nature. Nature and God. Such jocular syncretism, or indeed any extensive etiology, is common in fiction only from the 18th century onward. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, English translation was done in 1567. Meda's incestuous passion for her father creates the kind of situation the latter fascinated psychologists, but the narrator simply comments on that passion as criminal and disgusting without investigating why Meda had such an unusual craving. Presumably, fate or the gods are somehow responsible. With the rise of the sciences in the 18th century, however, tacit reference to supernatural influence was not enough to explain personality differences. Before the Romanticism of the early 19th century, the characters to be diagnosed seldom deviated far from normality, and thus were little in need of lavish elucidation. Thereafter, however, neurotics and psychotics began multiplying through a growing interest in extreme expressions of individuality. To demonstrate this individuality, authors must at some point diagnose characters' deviance from the norm, paradoxically, since what can be thus catalogued is not uniquely individual. The authors must also show a distaste for diagnosis itself. In Washington Square, 1880, Henry James's narrator details the characters' psychological quirks quite directly, yet the story turns against such insights. The shrewd Dr. Sloper, known for diagnosing in too much detail, ruins the daughter's life by exposing her fiancé's temperament. In later works, James continues to provide etiological information, but it is filtered through points of view that render it ambiguous, as in his novella. The Turn of the Screw, 1898, which never establishes whether its ghosts are real or symptoms of a governess's hysteria. Even more complexly, the narrator of Thomas Mann's Dr. Foster's the life of the German composer Adrian Leverkühn, as told by a friend, 1948, tries to demonstrate that the genius and mental illness of the composer Adrian Leverkühn are symptoms of both Germany's brilliance and its degeneration. Moreover, the narrator's mannered prose undercuts faith in his judgments. As Mann's essays also demonstrate, he considered the complexity of life to transcend simple categories on a somewhat less sophisticated level. His method of obsessive use of etiology, obsessive use of etiology, yet skepticism about its conclusions, who appears in many thrillers, including Thomas Harris's Red Dragon, 1981, and The Silence of the Lambs, 1988. In these works, both a psychoanalyst turned cannibal and the investigating detectives employ psychological profiling to this guesswork, which is not always accurate. Harris counterpoints pervasive religious imagery meant to give the evil an apocalyptic quality, but without reducing it to any single theory, either psychological or theological. In Against Interpretation and Other Essays, published in 1966, Susan Sontag combats the psychological and particularly the biographical study of literature. Accordingly, she peoples her novels with misfits on whom she comments in a manner that is more parody of psychology than a reliance on it. Comparably, Thomas Pynchon took imagery from Jung's psychological introduction to the Tibetan Book of the Dead and travestized it in his comic novel The Crying of Lot 49, published in 1966. As do others of Pynchon's fictions, it treats all analysis as itself a form of paranoia, causing controversy. The new novelist Elaine Robb Gillett placed obvious allusions to Oedipus, a basic pattern in the Freudian system, throughout La Gomme's 1953, The Erasers, 1964. He denied publicly that they were there. In her essays, Nathalie Sarraute, another new novelist, has explained that her characterization describes tropisms, behaviors with which people try to control one another. But she believes that no depths lie beneath these. Citations of psychological diagnoses merely to deny or ridicule them occur on a popular level. In such novels as Casey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1962, in which the character Nurse Ratched embodies a healthcare system eager to label patients as a way of demeaning and bullying them. Unrepentant confession. In classic psychoanalysis, discovering etiology is largely the doctor's role. The patient engages in a secular form of confession, as a result of which, unlike the religious version, no one is required to repent. Literature has followed a similar path. In Fyodor Dostoevsky's notes from the Underground, 1864, the narrator's almost gloating self-exposure without purgation or salvation broke with Christian contrition and set a model for 20th century confessional fiction. According to literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, Dostoevsky's later novels at their best consist of dialogue of voices presented without a commenting narrator. This would make Dostoevsky's works confessional throughout, but as Bakhtin admits, Dostoevsky sometimes resorts to diagnosis and etiology, as in the epilogue to Crime and Punishment, published in 1886, with an obtrusive psychology based on Christianity. At the beginning of the 20th century, André Gide's The Immoralist, published in 1930, took the confessional mode further toward the secular, until near the book's conclusion, its protagonist, Michel, is unaware of his homosexuality, so he cannot divulge it except by reporting behavior he understands less than do the readers. Furthermore, since homosexuality in the novel is not an action but a tendency, it is not, in Christian terms, a sin. Despite the guilt it instills, it does not seem susceptible to purgation. By persuasively associating the human condition with embarrassing impulses, the immoralist sets a despairing tone for the French fiction. This tone continued at least as late as Albert Camus, it is pronounced as Albert Camus but written as Albert Camus. Albert Camus' The Fall, published in 1957, its protagonist, Jean-Baptiste Clemens, is unwilling to risk his life to save a drowning man, disillusioned by his own cowardice. Clemens abandons conventional behavior and slips into cruelty, intent on convicting anyone that his imperfection springs from an ineradicable strain within humanity itself, a fall for which there is no savior. Like Michael's homosexuality, Clemens' sadism is one of the conditions that the first half of the 20th century brought to psychological attention. The age shocked by the repressed appears again in Kazuo Ishiguro's nostalgic novels. They show how reluctant people were to discover their own destructiveness, as shown in the disguised sadomasochistic relationship between Sachiko and Mariko in A Pale View of Ills, published in 1982, or in the self-delusions of character Christopher Banks in When We Were Orphans, published in 2000. Although, although Freud argued that aggressive and sensual drives might be sublimated into cultural achievements, novelists, along with the public, tended to be dismayed at psychology's disclosure of an unconscious prone to irrationality. With the exception of such nostalgic works as Ishiguro's confessional fictions in the 20th century's second half were not as easily dismayed by implacable instincts. In Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, 1962, reprinted with the final chapter in 1986, the narrator Alex is a rapist and murderer who is treated with aversion therapy so that he becomes nauseated at the thought of sex or violence. Readers are expected to condemn his psychological castration. In a victory of free will, however, he overthrows the conditioning and returns to committing mayhem. Comparably, in Orson Scott Card and Catherine H. Kidd's Lovelock, published in 1994, the narrator is an artificially enhanced capuchin monkey who, like Alex, must overcome his conditioning to be capable of sex and violence. Here, even more clearly than in A Clockwork Orange, evil is an animal side of the mind to be freed. Liberation of the bestial permeates many first-person works that were popular in the 1960s, such as Jack Kerouac's The Dharma Bums, 1958, and John Barthes' Guy's Goat Boy, or the Reverend New Syllabus, 1966. Although more conscious of evil than Kerouac, Barthes makes psychological liberation sound relatively innocent compared with Burgess, whose acute awareness of human destructiveness is more typical of British fiction, such as J.G. Ballard's Crash, published in 1973, which is about talking sadomasochistic joy in automobile accidents. Perhaps because the nature of drama predisposes to a public rituals. In such plays as Peter Shaffer's Equus, 1973, and in countless films, psychoanalysis itself forms a setting for confession. In first-person fiction, however, the closest analogy to it is the relationship between narrator and reader. When psychoanalyst-like figures are present in fiction, they are often disguised to emphasize either the negative or positive associations of psychiatry. Thus, fresh from a productive therapy with Jung, Hermann Hesse has made the rebellious, precocious title character of a Damien, published in 1990, English translation 1923, into its narrator's unofficial analyst. Similarly, in J.D. Salinger's Glass Family saga, such as Seymour and Introduction, published in 1963, Although family members sometimes find themselves on a psychiatrist's couch, the older brothers, one of whom commits suicide, combine the functions of guru and therapist. Whether the analyst is a cannibal or a friend who helps people live with their sins, the process has less to do with the penitence and forgiveness than with providing the readers entertainingly shocking revelations about what Joseph Conrad in his 1902 novel of the same name termed Humanity's Heart of Darkness. Now, stream of consciousness, it's a part of psychological, major part of psychological novel. The stream of consciousness. According to Keith M. May, stream of consciousness, an attempt to represent a barely conscious thinking, belongs to a relatively brief period when the two world wars led people to once again recognize human irrationality. Significantly, May omits a mention of Edward Dujardin's stream of consciousness novel, Well to the Woods No More. Well to the Woods No More, published in 1930, also known as the Bays Are Seer, 1991, which was published generations before World War the First. More perspectively, Doris Cohen contends that ungrammatical fragments in a stream of consciousness approximate a deep stratum of the mind, since the psycholinguistic Vygotsky has demonstrated such incoherence to be its nature. According to Shiv Kumar, an Indian poet and critic, according to Shiv Kumar, psychologist philosopher William James originated the phrase stream of consciousness in 1890, but it was introduced to literary criticism in a 1918 article by May Sinclair about the novels of Dorothy Richardson. In Pilgrimage, published in 1938 and later in 1967, Richardson conforms herself to her protagonist's consciousness without providing the customary information readers expect early in a book. 50 pages into the novel, the reader learns the character is a teenager. As Catherine Mansfield did for the short story, Richardson brought to the English novel the technique of stream of consciousness, whose major practitioners were Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and William Faulkner. The first of Woolf's novels to employ the technique is Jacob's Room, published in 1922, about the life of an Englishman who dies in a World War I. It repeatedly marks characters' inattention to traditional religion, even when church bells chime in the background. Her generation associated the stream of consciousness with a world that was replacing theology with psychology. By focusing on a single day, her next novel, Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925, achieves greater intensity in the depiction of relatively plotless mental flux, a unifying element, though is a repeated reference to Septimus Smith, who consults a psychiatrist and kills himself to avoid another physician. On an extreme level, his suicide parallels the importance that internal events have for the other characters. Although stream of consciousness means something slightly different in each novelist's works. James Joyce, James Joyce shows the greatest range of techniques. In his portrait of the artist as a young man, which was published in serial from 1914 to 1915, the book was finally published in 1916. Most sections are in third person, but they are so attuned to their protagonist's developing mind that they range from baby talk in the earlier ones to the erudition of an educated young man in the concluding ones. Joyce's Ulysses, published in 1922, however, unifies each section by parodying some genre or style such as journalistic prose or expressionistic drama. The last section, rendering the mind of Molly Bloom as she falls asleep, is a flow of words without punctuation that particularly suits the term stream of consciousness. Her monologue should not be confused with works whose authors simply provide their own musings. In the first draft of On the Road, published in 1957, Kerouac, at maximum speed, wrote the whole work as a single, unedited sentence to achieve a spontaneous self-revelation. In contrast, Joyce is distancing him from Molly's irrationality and somnolence. If a stream of consciousness means representation of one mind at a time, then Joyce's monumental last work, Finnegan's Way, published in 1932, has moved beyond it to a very non-lucid dream that takes incoherence almost to unintelligibility. Its readers enter something like Jung's collective unconscious, the whole human race's heritage of symbols. After treating Joyce's daughter, Jung misunderstood even Ulysses, which he considered the spontaneous outpourings of the hereditary madness exacerbated by alcohol. Although no proof of its author's insanity, the incoherence of stream of consciousness can well portray characters' mental aberrations. The first section of Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, published in 1929, records the barely comprehended sensory impressions occurring to Benji, an idiot. Readers then encounter the mental contents of other witnesses to the same story, including a young man who killed himself because of incestuous feelings for his sister. Similarly, in Faulkner's next novel, As I Lay Dying, published in 1930, Darl, a clairvoyant headed toward madness, is the character whose mind is most often sampled, although interest in stream of consciousness was fostered by the rise of psychology. The technique itself implies that a mind is being observed not clinically but telepathically. Thus, Darl's clairvoyance has much in common with those who write or read stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness. stream of consciousness began attracting a new generation of writers at the end of the 20th century. Two examples are Patrick McCabe, whose narrator in The Butcher Boy was published in 1992, is a young boy who deals with a troubled family by retreating to a fantasy world, and Irving Welsh, whose Train Spotting, published in 1993, is narrated by several drug users from the same town. Novels that employ wordplay, non-linear structure, and footnotes in addition to a stream of consciousness include Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves, published in 2000, Jonathan Safran-Foer's Everything is Illuminated, published in 2002, and Theodore Diaz's The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, published in 2007. The most celebrated example, however, is Toni Morrison's Beloved, published in 1987. Its protagonist is Sid, an escaped slave, traumatized by the brutality she endured and by the despair that led her to murder her daughter. Beloved Sid's narration is fragmented like the woman herself, and Morrison's use of a stream of consciousness helps readers understand Sid's psychological state. Now, next point, Kafkaesque fantasy. This is an adjective made from Kafka, an eminent dramatist and novelist of the time. A stream of consciousness views characters' minds as if the author were separate from them. In Kafkaesque literature, however, characters and their authors coverage. Indeed, Kafkaesque writers tend to place images of themselves within their works. Franz Kafka names the protagonist of Scholars, published in 1926, The Castle, 1930, with the initial K, while the main character of Der Prozess, published in 1925, The Trial, 1937. In Joseph K. Von Gutt puts himself in his own novel, Slaughterhouse 5, or The Children's Crusade, Duty Dance with Death, published in 1969, as a minor character who describes the book's composition and thereby tells the readers that the action is imaginary. Billy Pilgrim slips back and forth through time because of an association of ideas in Von Gutt's mind. Milan Kundera makes his part in composition even more explicit by interrupting action with essays explaining how he created one character or another. In his novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, published in 1984, he shapes the protagonist through meditations on living in truth, as the idea is expressed by Kafka and Václav Havel. Although Kafka himself was shuttler, examination of his work demonstrates that he structured events in quite as artificial a way as Kundera, with almost no attempt at verisimilitude. Rather, Kafkaesque fiction is like a lucid dream of or nightmare in which the action, however exciting, is never quite real. In non-Kafkaesque fiction, The work is a buffer between author and reader so that they lose sight of each other. The Kafkaesque creates at least the illusion of transparency where author and reader may glimpse one another as if they were characters. In Italo Calvino's if on a winter's night a traveler, if on a winter night's traveler, readers take an active part in the plot. Indeed, a male reader of Calvino's book is described as having romance with a female reader. If on a winter's night, a traveler is one of the most elaborate attempts to make you a character, but other notable novels that do this include Michael Butter's A Change of Heart, published in 1957, and Carlo Fuentes' novel Aura, published in 1962. In Kim Newman's second-person novel Life's Lottery, a choose your own adventure book, 1999, the reader is invited to become Keith, the protagonist, and to make decisions on his behalf. Choosing one path over another directs the reader to another section of novel. Kafka's Fragmentary, The Great Wall of China, and Other Pieces, published in 1933, has both a first-person narrator related complexly to Kafka himself and a you as protagonist. One way to understand the modern psychological novel is to show its development in the work of writers such as Joseph Conrad, Marcel Proust, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Franz Kafka, and William Faulkner. This list is by no means exclusive, but it represents those authors who are essential figures of the modernist literary canon. Along with their modernist contemporaries, Conrad, Proust, Joyce, Woolf, Kafka, and Faulkner are modern because they share certain literary preoccupations with an unstable modern world, have a diminishing belief in the idea of progress, are concerned with the radical subjectivity of the self, and consequently are preoccupied with the novelist's need to present reality from multiple perspectives. Of paramount concern to modernists is the question of how the world is perceived, or rather their concern is the difficulty of perceiving the world as an agreed upon or objective reality. Thus, the modern novel relies on stream of consciousness narrators and even unreliable witnesses to the present and the past, underscoring the strenuous effort by novelist and reader alike to arrive at a semblance of the truth. The modern novel, in other words, has an epistemological thrust, a dynamic questioning of what its characters know and how they think they know it. Now, to discuss a modern novelist, especially from psychological point of view, his characters, his plot, his theme. Joseph Conrad, born in 1857, died 1924. Many commentators on the modern novel date its inception to World War I and its aftermath because its horrors led to skepticism about moral values, religious principles, and political convictions that 19th century writers and readers believed were universal and enduring. The basic elements of modernism, however, evolved earlier. They appeared in Joseph Conrad's early work completed before World War I. Conrad experienced the sort of displacement and disorientation that are the hallmarks of high modernism, that is, of novels that inquire into the foundations of civilization, the core beliefs and modes of perception that 19th century novelists took for granted or only fitfully questioned. This was a time when Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud first began to undermine the Victorian confidence in a coherent universe. Conrad grew up in Russian-occupied Poland, the son of an impoverished Polish nobleman who wrote political plays and was persecuted by the Russians. Early on, Conrad absorbed the devastating history of Poland, an enlightened country that had been partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and had risen against its oppressors in several futile rebellions. Conrad left his native land and went to sea, deciding several years later to re-establish himself in England and pursue writing as a career. Conrad doubted the Victorian notion of progress. His novels, such as Heart of Darkness, published in 1899 serial, and the book was published in 1902, reminded the British that their island nation had once been a part of Roman Empire, and that the British movement in history, its pride in the achievements of imperialism, might be just that, a movement. Conrad ridiculed the European notion that its economy and political structures would prevail in history. He exposed the futile blindness of such pretensions in Nostromo, published in 1904, a novel that prophetically described the repetitive sound of revolution and counter-revolution. Charles Marlowe, Conrad's narrator in Heart of Darkness, Heart of Darkness, Victory, 1950, and other works, is a quintessential modernist because he cannot complacently accept civilization like his contemporaries. His views are anti-heroic and anti-romantic. He questions 19th century hero worship, which led Romantic and Victorian writers such as Thomas Carlyle and Ralph Waldo Emerson to argue that history is made by great men, and that history itself is just the sum of innumerable biographies of great men. Course in Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness sets out to become one of these great men, and it is Marlowe's task to discover why Kurz fails, not merely as a person, but as a representative of Western civilization attempting to bring its values to the so-called savages in Africa. Conrad's contribution to the modern novel is enormous. He brought a brooding, musing sensibility to narrative and an awareness of the way human consciousness feeds on itself, elaborates whole worlds rather than just describing them. Now, next, Marcel Proust, born in 1871 and died year 1922. Like Conrad, Marcel Proust grew up in an atmosphere of societal upheaval. The Commune of Paris, a popular uprising for a more democratic government, had failed in the year of the novelist's birth, and France had been defeated in war by Prussia. In this demoralized and uncertain environment, with a declining aristocracy and dynamic middle class, The sensitive Proust was exposed to an era of rapid change. Like Conrad, Proust relied on the supple and subtle perception of his narrator to convey a conception of society and history as a construct and extension of the human ego filtered through the sensibility of the artist. James Joyce, I have just discussed, but some other points are here. In a portrait of the artist as a young man, James Joyce extended the Proustian effort to render reality as it appeared to human consciousness by resorting to different linguistic registers with their own vocabulary and grammar. Thus, the child Stephen Dedalus emerges with his own language in the opening passage about a mukau. Joyce is not merely describing a child's world or picturing that world from the child's point of view, as Charles Dickens does in Great Expectations, published in 1860 to 1861, serial and book 1861. For example, on the contrary, Joyce inhabits a child's world using the child's words and phrases to create a sense of immediacy of what critics have called a stream of consciousness. Reality is not there to be observed, but rather to be created in the child's mind. Stephen is the artist already making up stories in his unusual style. The modern novelist captures the fluid nature of perception as it is enacted in the mind. Joyce's modernism is defined then not only by the method of narration but also his subject matter, woman as fully active and demanding sexual creatures, and who tell stories from their own point of view and with their own words. Like Proust, Joyce exercised a sort of sovereignty over his material, superiority over the requirements of both classical literature in the form of epics such as Homer's Odyssey. Joyce focused his novels on contemporary society, and it could be argued from a male point of view, notwithstanding his sensitive creation of characters like Molly Bloom and Gertie McDowell in Ulysses. And I have already discussed about Virginia Woolf, yet I would like to conclude with her. Virginia Woolf sought to bring the full weight of women's concerns and talents to the development of the modern novel. She rejected the rigid hierarchies of a male-dominated society and sought in her own fiction to portray women as proactive. Kafka, Franz Kafka. The phantasmagorical aspects of modernism take an even greater political dimensions in Franz Kafka's novels, especially The Trial, published in 1937. One of the most influential modernists, his fiction gave rise to the term Kafkaesque. Kafka explored the terror of 20th century society, in which an individual could be accused of a nameless crime, as in The Trial, and succumb to the bureaucratic maze of figures and institutions that persecute him or her. To many critics, the arbitrary nature of the trial, the arcane procedure used to determine the victim's guilt, and the constant pressing of a case against individual until he begins to believe himself guilty of the charges, presaged the regime of the totalitarian state later dramatized in the novels of Arthur Koestler and George Orwell. Kafka's novels verge on nihilism, that is important, nihilism, Shunyavad, यही है. Kafka's novels verge on nihilism, the conviction that there is no meaning in the universe. While he was certainly not the first writer to broach the notion of meaninglessness. After all, William Shakespeare's Macbeth decries a world that is full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Kafka was an original because his work reflects this nihilistic tendency in a logical and non-linear structures. In other words, the trial lives in a world that does not make sense to him and that cannot be explained in terms of his own failings or ignorance. William Faulkner. Faulkner's classic modernist novel, The Sound and the Fury, published in 1929, would seem to be a gloss of Kafka's nihilism. The novel is narrated both by an idiot named Benji and by his highly intelligent brother. So this way, dear students, I am successful to complete my lecture today, and this way my lecture is over. Thank you all of you for giving me patient hearing.